America invented car culture, designing their cities, their economy, their politics, and their society around the ownership of the humble automobile. And for a fleeting golden era of around 30 years, the nation's love affair with motoring appeared to be a symbol that the rest of the world aspired to replicate. Then, on October 6, 1973, the golden era suddenly came to an end, and decades of corporate inefficiency and highly uneconomical and flawed designs finally faced a cold realization. And for the remainder of the century, the US car industry was forced to struggle against an oncoming tide of foreign metal, as millions of buyers across the nation turned to their own builders and said they wanted something else, the start of what would be known as the Malaise Era of American motoring. The origins of the American automotive industry stretch back to the waning decades of the 19th century, a time marked by technological curiosity and entrepreneurial experimentation, and during this period, numerous investors, mechanics, and visionaries across the United States began working on self-propelled vehicles powered by steam, electricity, and gasoline. Among them was George B. Selden, a patent attorney and tinkerer from Rochester, New York, who in 1879 filed a patent for a road engine powered by an internal combustion engine, and though Selden never actually built a working model, his patent, which was finally granted in 1895 after years of strategic amendments, became a powerful legal instrument. Selden licensed it to a consortium of automakers and collected fees from nearly every manufacturer until Henry Ford challenged and eventually broke the monopoly through a landmark court case, though Ford argued that the patent had stifled innovation, and in 1911 the courts ruled in Ford's favor, significantly weakening Selden's grip on the burgeoning industry. During the same year that Selden's patent was granted, the Duryea brothers, Charles and Frank, successfully built and tested the first gasoline-powered vehicle in the United States, and would go on to establish the Duryea Motor Wagon Company, which became the first American firm to manufacture gasoline automobiles for sale, with their success sparking a flurry of activity, and by the dawn of the 20th century, more than 1,000 companies were engaged in some form of automobile production, with Detroit, thanks to its access to raw materials, skilled labor, and existing manufacturing infrastructure, quickly becoming the epicenter of this industrial surge. Among these many early pioneers, Ransom E. Olds and Henry Ford emerged as defining figures, with Olds having started producing cars in the late 1890s and was the first to introduce assembly line methods on a limited scale with the curved dash Oldsmobile in 1901, though it was Ford who radically transformed manufacturing with his refined moving assembly line introduced in 1913. Ford's system revolutionized the scale and speed of production, drastically cutting costs and making cars accessible to a wider swathe of the American public, with the Ford Model T introduced in 1908 embodying this shift, with the car initially being priced at $850, though its costs dropped to less than $300 within 15 years, allowing working-class families to own a car for the first time. The rise of Ford's production methods ushered in a new era of industrial standardization and economic influence, while the rival General Motors was founded in 1908 by former carriage maker William Durant, who rapidly consolidated several smaller automakers, including Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac, with Durant envisaging a multi-brand strategy that could cater to different consumer tastes and income levels. By contrast, Ford's philosophy was one model for all, while in 1925, Walter Chrysler reorganized the struggling Maxwell Motor Company into the Chrysler Corporation, swiftly acquiring Dodge and launching new brands like DeSoto and Plymouth, with the late 1920s seeing these three companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, having established a dominance that would earn them the collective moniker of the Big Three. The widespread adoption of the automobile demanded an extensive transformation of the nation's infrastructure, and in response, the federal government passed legislation that would reshape the American landscape, with the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 and the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921, providing millions in funding to improve and expand the country's roadways. By 1924, over 31,000 miles of paved roads had been laid, a dramatic increase that enabled long-distance travel, accelerated the growth of suburbs, and allowed cars to become more deeply integrated into everyday life. But while the 1920s had been marked by rapid expansion, the prosperity was uneven and short-lived, as when the Great Depression struck at the end of the decade, it brought severe hardship to the automotive sector. Dozens of smaller car companies folded or were absorbed, while consumers cut back on purchases, though despite these conditions, the Big Three managed to survive and even innovate, with the 1930s seeing several technological advancements appear, including hydraulic braking systems, independent front suspension, and more reliable transmissions, while designs also evolved, with sleeker bodies and improved performance becoming selling points in an increasingly competitive market. The same decade also witnessed the rise of labor unions, with the auto workers having faced long hours, physically demanding conditions, and minimal job security, forming the United Automobile Workers, or UAW, which marked a turning point in industrial labor relations. And after a series of high-profile strikes, the UAW was officially recognized by General Motors and Chrysler in 1937, with Ford, long resistant to unionization, finally following suit in 1941. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and America's entry in 1941 caused a dramatic pivot in the industry, with civilian automobile production being abruptly halted by early 1942 as factories were retooled to support the war effort, while the American government placed nearly $10 billion in defense contracts with the auto industry. Plants that once produced sedans and coupes began turning out tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and ammunition, while new factories were constructed, including the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford produced B-24 Liberator bombers at an astonishing rate, with Detroit's transformation earning it the nickname Arsenal of Democracy, a symbol of American industrial might. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had emerged as the undisputed leader in global automobile construction, and with American manufacturing now free from wartime production constraints, it pivoted quickly to civilian goods, with the automakers returning to the construction of passenger cars on a scale that had been unprecedented during the pre-war years. By 1950, the United States was producing around 8 million vehicles annually, accounting for roughly three-quarters of the world's total output, this figure complementing the rise in car ownership, which had risen from just 1% in 1908 when the Model T was introduced to 50% by 1948 and 75% by 1960, with the car now no longer a luxury, but was instead a fixture of American life as essential as the refrigerator or the television. As millions of returning servicemen married, started families, and moved into newly constructed suburbs, the automobile became indispensable, with the design of sprawling suburban communities virtually requiring car ownership, with few sidewalks, a scarcity of public transit, and the nearest supermarket, school, or job often lying miles away. As consumer culture flourished in the 1950s, so did expectations for style, comfort, and performance, with Americans not just wanting a car that worked, but one that turned heads, with this era ushering in an explosion of automotive design influenced by the jet age and the space race, with automobiles sporting soaring tail fins, acres of chrome, oversized grills, and sweeping lines meant to evoke motion and modernity. Arlie Earl, the legendary design chief at General Motors, pioneered many of these trends, his work bringing a sense of spectacle to the road, with cars like the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado appearing more like spacecraft than sedans, with exaggerated contours and flamboyant detailing that made them instantly recognizable, the car very much becoming an extension of one's own personality and a member of the family all at the same time. The 1950s was also the decade when American manufacturers diversified their product lines to appeal to different segments of the market, with the introduction of the Chevrolet Corvette in 1953, marking the first time an American automaker had created a true sports car to compete with European imports, with this machine being sleek, nimble, and distinctive, and thus squarely aimed at the performance-orientated driver. Ford countered this with the Thunderbird in 1955, originally conceived as a direct competitor to the Corvette, but later repositioned as the first true personal luxury car, which was more focused on comfort and flair than raw speed, while for mainstream buyers, cars like the Chevrolet Bel Air delivered modern styling and new technology at an affordable price, making them a staple of middle-class garages. This automotive boom generated a seismic shift in the American economy, with the car industry becoming a keystone of national prosperity, directly employing hundreds of thousands and indirectly supporting millions more through related sectors in steel, glass, rubber, petroleum, construction, finance, advertising, and retail, while roadside America flourished with drive-in restaurants, motels, gas stations, and sprawling dealership lots, which became familiar features across the national landscape, with this new economic sector being supported by cultural and social changes that were directly influenced by car availability, with new terms such as the Sunday drive and the cross-country road trip quickly being cemented in the public consciousness. By the dawn of the 1960s, the American automotive landscape was almost entirely dominated by the Big Three, with these corporate giants controlling nearly 9/10 of the domestic market, while for most Americans, the idea of buying a foreign car remained foreign itself, with European imports, largely limited to niche models such as the Volkswagen Beetle, being seen as curiosities rather than serious contenders, while Japanese manufacturers had virtually no presence. This was supported by the fact that by 1960, 3 out of every 4 households owned at least one vehicle, a testament to the powerful mix of post-war economic prosperity, sprawling suburban development, and inexpensive petrol, with families relocating in even greater numbers from urban cores to the rapidly growing suburbs, where space was plentiful and public transport remained a rarity and an afterthought. Midway through the decade, tastes began to shift, with 1964 seeing Ford unveil the Mustang, a sleek, affordable coupe that ignited the pony car craze, with its long bonnet, compact cabin, and youthful image, making it an instant success, outselling projections by a wide margin and sending ripples through the industry that rival manufacturers scrambled to respond to. In 1966, Chevrolet would introduce the Camaro, followed shortly by the Pontiac Firebird, Dodge Challenger, and AMC Javelin, with the pony car being born not just as a new vehicle class, but as a cultural phenomenon, featuring in films, music, and advertising that reinforced the image of freedom, rebellion, and horsepower. That same year, another trend emerged in the form of the muscle car, and while definitions vary, the 1964 Pontiac GTO is often cited as the originator of the genre, this car being built on a mid-sized platform with a powerful V8 engine that offered drag-strip-worthy performance at affordable prices, with models like the Chevrolet Chevelle SS, Dodge Charger RT, Plymouth Roadrunner, and AMC's SC Rambler following suit, forming the core of a movement aimed squarely at the young male driver. Yet while performance was king, a quieter shift was occurring elsewhere in the market, with compact cars beginning to gain ground, with the American Motors Corporation, or AMC, long the underdog of the domestic industry and having been formed through the merger of the smallest of America's mainstream car builders to avoid their total absorption by the Big Three, having introduced the Rambler during the previous decade. The success of this modest, economical model forced Detroit's heavyweights to reconsider their offerings, and in response, Ford launched the Falcon, Chevrolet released the Corvair, and Chrysler countered with the Plymouth Valiant, these cars being aimed at the new demographic of budget-conscious buyers who valued practicality over size, a shift that signaled the first serious crack in the long-standing assumption that bigger was always better. By the late 1960s, foreign brands began to penetrate the American market with greater force, with the Volkswagen Beetle in particular achieving a cult status thanks to its distinctive styling, low cost, and unpretentious charm, while Japanese automakers, including Toyota and Datsun, began to build their presence, offering small, efficient cars with a reputation for reliability, and though their market share remained modest during this period, the seeds were sown for a dramatic realignment in the years to come. Detroit, meanwhile, continued to focus on prestige and performance, with American cars becoming more luxurious, laden with power features, air conditioning, vinyl roofs, and plush interiors, while the personal luxury car emerged as a popular segment, with models such as the Buick Riviera, Ford Thunderbird, and Oldsmobile Toronado blending style with comfort and status. These vehicles were tailored for an older, more affluent demographic and marked a shift towards a more passive driving experience, though regardless, the industry continued to stoke the flames of performance, releasing special editions and homologation models for racing, while magazine road tests and television adverts turned acceleration times and horsepower ratings into household talking points. However, the meteoric rise of the American auto industry and the impact of car culture was not one that went without opposition, as economic headwinds, regulatory intervention, technological stagnation, and rising international competition steadily eroded Detroit's long-standing supremacy. Signs of the fragility of the American car industry were first illustrated in 1958 with the Eisenhower Recession, which dealt the first serious blow to the post-war automotive boom, with unemployment rising and consumer confidence being shaken, while car sales slumped and inventory swelled on dealer lots. This contraction, which officially lasted from the middle of 1957 until April 1958, disrupted the American economy at multiple levels, undermining industrial productivity, triggering widespread unemployment, and altering the patterns of consumer behavior that had defined the decade's prosperity, with its repercussions extending beyond the borders of the United States, with economies in Europe and Canada also experiencing significant reverberations. One of the most visible and damaging elements of the 1958 downturn was the severe collapse of new car sales, with the trend of the mid-1950s being for American families to replace their vehicles every few years, drawn by the promise of modern styling, new features, and increased performance. But as financial confidence declined and recessionary figures set in, consumers began to abandon this pattern of frequent trade-ins and upgrades. Instead, many chose to keep their cars longer, a decision that, although logical for individual households, had catastrophic effects on the industry as a whole, with the decline in sales being staggering. As compared to the previous year, new car purchases fell by 31%, making 1958 the worst year for the automotive sector since the end of World War II, and represented a drop from nearly 8 million vehicles sold in 1955 to just 4.3 million in 1958, essentially halving the market within only a few years. This dramatic contraction dealt a devastating blow not only to the bottom lines of car manufacturers, but to a vast network of related industries and local economies, with Detroit as the epicenter of American automotive production suffering acutely, and Michigan as a whole would see its unemployment rate soar to 11%, with Detroit's jobless figures peaking at an extraordinary 20%, a number driven largely by a near 50% decline in auto production. The ripple effect was immense, with sectors that supply the auto industry, such as steel, rubber, glass, and textiles, also contracting rapidly, as did ancillary services like transportation and advertising, with cities across the industrial Midwest that depended heavily on durable goods manufacturing, finding themselves caught in a web of layoffs, plant closures, and falling consumer confidence. In a desperate attempt to reverse the trend and stimulate sales, car dealerships resorted to aggressive and often theatrical promotional efforts, with one particularly illustrative case occurring at a DeSoto dealership in St. Louis, which kept its sales team working around the clock for 64 consecutive hours during a so-called sellathon, with this extreme effort temporarily pushing up local sales by an impressive 73%, but such gains were short-lived and ultimately failed to alter the broader trajectory of the industry. Meanwhile, long-term investment across the manufacturing sector was shrinking, and orders for capital goods, such as machinery, equipment, and factory expansions, fell dramatically as companies postponed or cancelled plans for growth, while other economic indicators further reinforced the downturn, with the housing market, another key pillar of the post-war American economy, already cooling by the mid-1950s due to rising interest rates. By 1957, construction of new housing units had dropped to around 1.2 million annually, contributing to the recession's depth and complexity, and across the board, industrial production slowed, business confidence faltered, and the nation seemed gripped by a sense of caution and retrenchment. Eventually, the federal government stepped in to stabilize the situation and hasten recovery, with the Eisenhower administration, alongside Congress and the Federal Reserve, implementing a range of measures aimed at boosting demand and restoring economic confidence, with infrastructure projects being fast-tracked, particularly those already in the pipeline or previously funded, in order to create jobs and stimulate economic activity. The Department of Agriculture accelerated rural electrification and water resource initiatives, while Congress moved to ease restrictions on no-down payment mortgage loans in hopes of reviving the housing sector, alongside unemployment benefits being extended and monetary policy being loosened, with the Federal Reserve reducing the discount rate to stimulate borrowing and investment. Though these measures eventually bore fruit, the recession of 1958 revealed how deeply the American economy had become tied to consumer behavior, and how reliant it was on certain key sectors, especially automobiles, to maintain growth, with the cultural dominance of the car suddenly appearing vulnerable, also ushering in new and radical methods of reducing construction costs, while at the same time encouraging more frequent vehicle replacement by consumers to keep the market healthy. The most significant of these strategies was planned obsolescence, a term that denotes the intentional design of products with a curtailed lifespan or with features that decline in utility over time, with this approach seeking to drive consumer behavior by creating a perpetual cycle of consumption, as rather than building products to last, manufacturers intentionally engineered obsolescence into their offerings, compelling customers to purchase replacements more frequently than they otherwise would have. Planned obsolescence was not a new concept by the 1950s, as General Motors, under the stewardship of Alfred P. Sloan in the 1920s, had formalized and industrialized the concept within the world of car manufacturing, which at the time was seeing the American automotive market reach saturation, with a significant proportion of the population who could afford a car having already bought one, and the notion of a one-time purchase was becoming an existential threat to the long-term profitability of automakers. Sloan, recognizing this looming stagnation, devised a new business model, one that relied not on a car's mechanical failure, but on psychological and stylistic obsolescence, as instead of persuading customers to buy cars when their old ones broke down, GM would encourage them to buy new ones because the latest model looked newer, more stylish, and more sophisticated than last year's. The introduction of annual model changes became a cornerstone of this strategy, and although many of these changes were superficial, ranging from slight adjustments to the body shape, grille, or trim, they were heavily marketed as major improvements, with this constant restyling fostering a cultural atmosphere in which car ownership became closely tied to one's social standing and public image. As the 1950s progressed, planned obsolescence became deeply embedded in American automotive manufacturing, and with rising wages, expanding suburbs, and the growing prevalence of car culture, this meant that consumers were both willing and able to buy new cars more frequently, and manufacturers took advantage of this by limiting the availability of spare parts for older models, discontinuing support for previous year's vehicles, and even using materials that were prone to quicker deterioration. This approach yielded impressive short-term results, with sales soaring, profits swelling, and the American automobile industry becoming one of the dominant forces in the global economy, though the long-term implications rapidly became evident, with critics beginning to question the ethics of designing products to fail or become socially outdated, while concerns also emerged about the environmental impact of discarding vehicles that were still technically functional. In the wake of the Eisenhower Recession, the practice had evolved into a structural tenet of the industry, with vehicles being designed with components that were difficult for owners or independent manufacturers to repair, effectively locking customers into a relationship with authorized dealers and increasing the cost of maintenance, while parts were often unique to a single model year, making intercompatibility across generations virtually impossible, and, in some cases, essential components were sealed or designed in ways that discouraged repair altogether. The materials used in manufacturing, particularly plastics and other lightweight compounds, were sometimes chosen for aesthetic appeal or production efficiency rather than durability, with this shift from utility to disposability reflecting a broader societal transformation, where the pace of consumption became more important than the longevity of goods. However, while the automakers updated their manufacturing and marketing policies to keep up with an ever-changing social and economic landscape, the Big Three were further impacted by a new and increasingly vocal public scrutiny through regulations and congressional acts, with 1963 seeing the Clean Air Act mark the federal government's first significant step into automotive regulation. The origins of the act went back to the end of the Second World War, where the subsequent explosion of industrial and economic activity saw cities grow and flourish, but so too did the volume of pollutants released into the atmosphere, with urban centers, especially those surrounded by heavy industry, beginning to experience increasingly frequent and severe pollution events. Among the most alarming was the smog disaster that struck Donora, Pennsylvania in October 1948, during which a thick stagnant cloud of industrial pollutants settled over the town for several days, resulting in dozens of deaths and widespread illness. But despite the rising public concern, federal intervention remained cautious throughout the 1950s, with air quality being largely treated as a local or state matter, with the federal government adopting only a limited role. The Air Pollution Control Act of 1955, the first federal legislation to address air pollution, stopped short of imposing any enforceable regulations, and instead focused on supporting research into the sources and effects of air pollution, allocating funds to the U.S. Public Health Service for study and technical assistance. And while the act represented an acknowledgement that air quality was a legitimate public health concern, it did not provide the legal authority or enforcement mechanisms needed to compel polluters to reduce emissions. By the early 1960s, a consensus began to emerge among scientists, public health experts, and environmental advocates that piecemeal state-led strategies were insufficient, and a growing body of scientific evidence demonstrated the harmful impacts of airborne pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter, with these substances being linked to an array of chronic health problems, including asthma, lung cancer, heart disease, and premature death. Public advocacy intensified, fueled by rising media coverage and grassroots pressure on elected officials, and it was in this context that federal legislators moved to develop a more coordinated and effective national response, culminating in the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1963, a landmark statute that marked the beginning of modern air quality regulation in the United States. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on December 17th of that year, the act conferred upon the federal government, for the first time, the authority to take direct action to mitigate air pollution, empowering the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare to launch and oversee programs aimed at controlling air contaminants, and provided financial support to states and municipalities through grants and technical assistance. Although the Act did not immediately mandate national air quality standards, it established the legal and institutional framework that would support more aggressive policies in subsequent years, while also initiating a crucial phase of federal-state cooperation in air quality management, with the federal government assuming a leadership role in setting objectives and funding research. While the 1963 Act addressed a broad range of pollution sources, increasing attention in the mid-1960s turned to the automobile, with urban smog, particularly in cities like Los Angeles, being increasingly linked to vehicular emissions, with Congress introducing the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act in 1965 as an amendment to the original Clean Air Act, which established the first federal emission standards for motor vehicles, mandating substantial reductions in hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and crankcase emissions for all cars sold beginning with the 1968 model year. The automobile industry was thus thrust into a new regulatory environment, as for decades manufacturers such as General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler have prioritized performance, aesthetic appeal, and power output, often at the expense of environmental considerations, with the 1965 amendment having fundamentally altered the calculus, and automakers now face mandatory compliance with federal emissions limits, requiring them to invest in engineering solutions to reduce exhaust pollutants. The industry responded by implementing technologies such as positive crankcase ventilation or PCV systems and began early research into exhaust aftertreatment devices, with these changes involving considerable costs and logistical challenges, including redesigning engines, modifying production lines, and adapting to new testing and certification procedures imposed by federal agencies. Environmental considerations were not the only priority of the motor industry during this period, as safety also became a factor following the 1965 publication of Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, a blistering exposé of the industry's neglect of safety that shocked the public and galvanized a political movement that demanded greater accountability from manufacturers. The roots of the book stretch back nearly a decade, beginning in 1956, when Nader was a second-year student at Harvard Law School. As even by this point, Nader had become increasingly concerned about the mounting death toll on American roads and the lack of meaningful safety measures in cars that were becoming faster, heavier, and more complex. Thus, he began to write about what he saw as fatal oversights in automobile design, starting with a provocative article titled "American Cars Designed for Death," which laid the intellectual and moral groundwork for what would become Unsafe at Any Speed, while by the early 1960s, Nader's writing and activism had begun to attract attention within political and regulatory circles. His work came to the notice of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Assistant Secretary of Labor under the Kennedy administration, with Moynihan inviting Nader to work as a consultant on highway safety, assigning him to compile research that would be presented to Congress, with this research evolving into the foundational material for Nader's book. Despite initial reluctance from publishers, many of whom doubted the commercial viability of a critical data-heavy book about motor vehicle safety, Nader eventually found an ally in Richard L. Grossman, a New York publisher who recognized the potential for wide societal impact, with Grossman agreeing to publish the book, which was officially released on November 30, 1965 by Grossman Publishers. The first chapter set the tone for the entire volume and targeted the Chevrolet Corvair, a compact car developed by General Motors and sold between 1960 and 1963, with Nader arguing that the Corvair's swing-axle rear suspension system rendered it dangerously prone to rollovers under certain driving conditions, especially when driven by unsuspecting motorists unfamiliar with its peculiar handling characteristics. The design flaw, according to Nader, was not only known to engineers within the company, but was also left uncorrected due to cost-cutting decisions made by upper management. And although a later 1972 report by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration would determine that the Corvair was no more dangerous than its contemporaries, by that time the damage to GM's reputation had already been done. Beyond the Corvair, the book presented a devastating critique of the entire American car industry, exposing a culture in which visual aesthetics and market gimmicks were favored over structural integrity, user protection, and mechanical resilience, with Nader detailing the dangers of glare from chrome-finished dashboards, the inconsistency and confusion of gearshift arrangements, and the absence of standardized safety mechanisms like collapsible steering columns or padded interiors. He examined how cost-benefit analyses often favored superficial features over life-saving technologies and accused engineers of complacency and designers of recklessness, all while highlighting that American road deaths were not an unfortunate inevitability, but a preventable epidemic caused, at least in part, by systemic negligence. Nader's accusations initially drew limited public attention, though the turning point came in early 1966, when it was revealed that General Motors had employed private investigators to trail Nader in an effort to dig up compromising personal information, with their aim being to discredit him and undermine the influence of his findings. This campaign including surveillance, attempted entrapment, and an invasion of Nader's privacy that shocked the public when it was brought to light. The scandal culminated in a Senate subcommittee hearing, where GM's president was compelled to issue a formal apology, and Nader in turn sued the company for invasion of privacy, and in 1970 he won a $425,000 settlement, though rather than taking the money, he used it to establish the Center for Auto Safety, a non-profit organization that would go on to campaign for transparency, accountability, and reform in the automotive sector. The GM surveillance scandal propelled Unsafe at Any Speed onto the bestseller lists and made Nader a household name, with this book quickly becoming a cornerstone of the burgeoning consumer protection movement, while the political momentum it generated contributed directly to the swift passage of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act in September 1966, as well as the Highway Safety Act passed shortly thereafter. These pieces of legislation marked the beginning of systemic federal regulation of vehicle safety in the United States, and mandated the inclusion of features such as seatbelts, improved braking systems, safety glass, padded interiors, and energy-absorbing steering columns, though most significantly, they created the institutional machinery necessary for long-term oversight, leading to the establishment of the Department of Transportation and later the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The ripple effects were profound, with car manufacturers, once insulated from accountability, being forced to reassess their priorities and invest in genuine safety innovations, with vehicles undergoing major design transformations over subsequent decades, and technologies like airbags, anti-lock braking systems, crumple zones, and electronic stability control would become standard. However, the book was not without its critics, with some engineers and industry figures arguing that Nader had failed to appreciate the complex trade-offs involved in automotive design, especially those balancing cost, performance, and consumer preferences, while others pointed out that similar rear suspension systems were used in several European cars at the time, such as the Volkswagen Beetle and certain Porsche models, yet these were not given the same scrutiny, though these objections did little to stem the tide of public opinion that had swung decisively in Nader's favor. Amid these direct blows against the car makers through environmental and safety concerns, broader economic and geopolitical conditions began to turn against the foundations of American automotive hegemony, with oil, once abundant and cheap, beginning to show signs of becoming a strategic liability, with domestic U.S. oil production having peaked in 1970, after which the nation's dependency on foreign imports accelerated sharply. The question of foreign oil imports to support the rise of car culture was one that had been demonstrated as early as 1953 with the Iranian coup d'etat, which was deeply rooted in the economic and strategic imperatives of the Western powers, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, who sought to maintain control over Iran's abundant oil reserves. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's bold decision to nationalize the Iranian oil industry in 1951 was seen as a direct threat to this economic order, and by wresting control of oil production from the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Mossadegh challenged a long-standing colonial arrangement in which Iran received a disproportionately small share of its own oil revenues, while the West reaped the majority of the benefits. This act of nationalization, while hugely popular among Iranians, alarmed Western governments, and Britain's initial response included an international boycott of Iranian oil and covert attempts to destabilize Mossadegh's government. But when these efforts failed to produce results, the British turned to the United States for assistance. America, initially hesitant under the Truman administration, shifted its stance after President Eisenhower took office, and the Cold War provided a convenient framework for justifying intervention, with American officials portraying Mossadegh's weakening hold on power and the growing presence of the Tudor or Communist Party as a potential prelude to Soviet domination, though later declassified documents and scholarly analysis made clear that the real fear was not of communism, but of the precedent Mossadegh's success would set if other oil-producing nations chose to nationalize their industries. The CIA and MI6 coordinated Operation Ajax, a covert mission involving propaganda, bribes, and the orchestration of street protests that culminated in Mossadegh's overthrow and the reinstallation of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as an absolute monarch, with the Shah's regime, now dependent on American support, allowing Western oil companies, including a newly created consortium of American, British, and other European firms, to regain access to Iran's oil under more favorable terms. Therefore, by the early 1970s, the bulk of U.S. oil imports came from the Middle East, placing the stability of the American economy in the hands of geopolitics far beyond Detroit's control. And while petrol remained inexpensive on the surface, the foundations were extremely fragile and depended entirely on the maintenance of key international agreements and relationships in politically volatile regions. Meanwhile, the concerns weren't just in terms of fuel imports, but also wider economic policies, as in 1971, President Richard Nixon chose to end the Bretton Woods system by taking the dollar off the gold standard, which added another layer of instability, and inflation began to climb. The Bretton Woods Agreement, forged in July 1944 amid the waning months of the Second World War, was developed to construct a stable, cooperative framework for international economic relations, with the conference bringing together the key economic minds of the time, most notably John Maynard Keynes of Great Britain and Harry Dexter White of the United States, whose competing visions for global finance shaped the final outcome. The agreement, signed at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, sought to avoid a return to the economic chaos of the interwar years, marked by protectionism, competitive devaluations, and the collapse of the gold standard, all of which had contributed to the Great Depression and ultimately global conflict, with the core of the new system being a regime of fixed exchange rates, in which currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. With the dollar now placed centrally as the global currency, two major international institutions were established under the Bretton Woods framework to uphold and manage this new order, with the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, being created to monitor exchange rates and provide short-term financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments difficulties, aiming to stabilize economies without resorting to damaging austerity or trade barriers. Alongside it, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now known as the World Bank, was tasked with facilitating long-term investment in war-torn and developing countries, helping to rebuild infrastructure and stimulate economic growth, with this combination of fixed currency values and multilateral cooperation being intended to promote global financial stability, prevent competitive currency manipulation, and ensure the steady expansion of international trade and investment. Initially, the system performed remarkably well, and in the decades immediately following the war, the world experienced an unprecedented period of sustained economic growth, expanding international commerce, and relative monetary stability, while the dollar's preeminence was supported by the United States commanding industrial output and its vast gold reserves, which at the end of the war made up the majority of the world's supply. However, as the global economy recovered and grew through the 1950s and 60s, underlying weaknesses in the Bretton Woods arrangement began to emerge, chief among which was the inherent contradiction of maintaining a dollar-based gold standard in a rapidly expanding global economy, as in order to provide sufficient international liquidity, the United States was compelled to run persistent balance of payments deficits, which led to a steady increase in the number of dollars held abroad, though as these dollars accumulated, confidence in the United States' ability to convert them into gold at a fixed rate eroded. This problem became especially acute during the 1960s, as U.S. expenditures surged due to the escalating involvement in the Vietnam War and ambitious domestic social programs under President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiative, while at the same time, generous foreign aid commitments and overseas military spending added to the dollar's global circulation, with the United States, in effect, issuing more dollars than it could credibly back with gold, with this overextension beginning to raise alarm among foreign governments and financial markets. Confidence in the fixed exchange rate system weakened as countries such as France began demanding gold in exchange for their growing dollar reserves, and with these redemptions placing mounting pressures on US gold stocks, this threatened to expose the imbalance at the heart of the system. Faced with a deteriorating economic situation characterized by inflation, a widening trade deficit, and diminishing gold reserves, President Nixon convened a secret meeting of his top economic advisors in August 1971 at Camp David, with the resultant sweeping policy shift, announced to the American public on August 15th of that year, and later dubbed the Nixon Shock, seeing the unilateral suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, effectively ending the gold standard and shattering the core mechanisms of the Bretton Woods system. This move, taken without prior consultation with international partners, also included a 90-day wage and price freeze to curb inflation and a 10% import surcharge intended to force U.S. trading partners to revalue their currencies and reduce trade imbalances, with the Nixon administration's dramatic actions sending shockwaves through the global financial system. While some nations initially protested what they saw as a unilateral and destabilizing move, it quickly became apparent that the pre-existing system was no longer viable, and in December 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement was reached among the group of 10 industrialized nations which attempted to salvage fixed exchange rates by devaluing the dollar and widening the permissible trading bands, though these efforts proved insufficient. Continued speculative attacks on currencies and an erosion of faith in centralized monetary control forced policymakers to abandon the fixed exchange rate framework altogether, and by March 1973, major world economies had transitioned to a system of floating exchange rates where currency values were determined by market forces rather than government policy. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system had profound implications for the American economy, initially through the devaluation of the dollar providing a short-term boost by making American exports cheaper and more competitive internationally, but this also meant that imported goods became more expensive, contributing to a surge in inflation, while the broader economic environment of the early 1970s deteriorated rapidly, and a new and deeply destabilizing phenomenon also emerged called stagflation, where high inflation coexisted with stagnant economic growth and rising unemployment. One of the industries most affected by this new economic climate was the American car industry, as with the weakening of the dollar, This meant that imported vehicles, particularly those from Japan, became more competitive in relative terms, with companies such as Toyota, Honda, and Datsun offering smaller, more fuel-efficient cars that were also seen as more reliable and better built, drawing American consumers away from domestic brands. American car manufacturers struggled to respond quickly, with their production lines, corporate cultures, and union contracts being orientated towards large-scale, standardized models and high-volume sales, while adapting to a new market reality required nimbleness, innovation, and investment in quality, areas where the Big Three were found wanting. Inflation drove up the cost of labor and materials, eroding profitability, while rising interest rates made consumer credit more expensive, dampening demand, or while the increased volatility in currency exchange rates following the end of Bretton Woods exposed American car makers to foreign competition in ways they had not previously experienced, with exchange rate fluctuations now rapidly altering the competitive landscape, and without the buffer of fixed rates, US manufacturers found it harder to shield themselves from global pressures. This was combined with more policy-based punishments from Washington upon the car makers, with environmental regulations continuing to advance, with the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 demanding a 90% reduction in tailpipe emissions by 1975, a goal that required an overhaul of engine design, fuel chemistry, and emissions control technologies, while the newly established Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, now had the authority to enforce these targets, and automakers scrambled to comply. The initial responses were crude and often counterproductive, as in order to reduce emissions, compression ratios were lowered and engines were detuned, leading to notable drops in performance and fuel economy, while smog pumps, early catalytic converters, and exhaust gas recirculation systems were bolted on with minimal integration, causing reliability problems and eroding customer satisfaction, while compounded the issue was a change in horsepower rating methodology, and in 1971 the industry shifted from gross to net ratings, making the power reductions appear even more severe on paper, further damaging the image of American performance. Meanwhile, the regulatory onslaught continued with new safety mandates, with 1973 seeing the federal government introduce 5-mile-an-hour bumper standards, requiring vehicles to withstand low-speed collisions without damage to safety-critical components, and though automakers met these regulations by affixing oversized, protruding steel bumpers to existing designs, this degraded the styling, increased weight, and worsened aerodynamics. Therefore, with the American car industry, despite its exceptional size and output, resting upon highly fragile foundations in terms of management, engineering, economics, and political backing, all it would take was a market shock to send each of the Detroit Big Three into a spiral from which they would struggle to recover, with that shock coming in October 1973 with the oil crisis, as implemented by the nations behind the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC. The original Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC or OPEC, was officially established on September 14, 1960, during a conference held in Baghdad, with the founding members being Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Kuwait, all nations that, at the time, were heavily reliant on oil revenues, yet had little control over the pricing or distribution of their resources. Their decision to form OPEC was triggered by a series of unilateral price reductions imposed by multinational oil corporations, collectively known as the Seven Sisters, with these companies having long dominated the oil industry, setting posted prices in a way that disproportionately benefited consuming countries and private shareholders, while depriving producing nations of a fair share of the profits. The purpose of OPEC was to provide a unified platform for petroleum exporting states to coordinate their policies, defend their economic interests, and secure stable and equitable oil prices, and in the years that followed, OPEC gradually expanded its membership to include a broader range of oil-producing countries from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, significantly increasing its influence within the global energy market. 8 years after the founding of OPEC, in January 1968, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC or OAPEC, was formed by Kuwait, Libya, and Saudi Arabia, and unlike OPEC, which was global in scope, OAPEC was created with a regional focus, with it being initially intended to foster cooperation among Arab oil producers and to manage oil policy independently of political pressures, particularly in the wake of the short-lived 1967 embargo that followed the Six-Day War. However, the original aim of keeping oil and politics separate began to unravel in the early 1970s, with the admission of more politically assertive states, such as Egypt, Syria, Algeria, and Iraq, gradually transforming OAPEC into a more interventionist organization, while increasingly willing to use oil as a diplomatic tool in support of Arab causes, particularly the Palestinian issue and opposition to Israel. It will be the broader Arab-Israeli conflict that would call the hand of OPEC to use oil as a form of diplomacy, with the conflict having begun with the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, with hostilities commencing almost immediately after Israel's declaration of independence, setting the stage for decades of warfare and political instability. One of the most notable early confrontations was the Suez Crisis of 1956, as following Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, a critical waterway previously controlled by British and French interests, and thereby blocking Israeli access to the Red Sea via the Straits of Tiran, Israel, France, and the United Kingdom launched a joint military operation against Egypt. Although militarily successful, the invasion provoked international condemnation and was ultimately halted under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, with the Suez Canal being closed for several months during the conflict, disrupting global shipping and contributing to the sense that control over energy routes could have strategic global implications. In 1967, the region was again plunged into war during the Six-Day War, with this conflict seeing Israel launch a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, seizing large swathes of territory including the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, while in response, Egypt closed the Suez Canal, this time for an extended period of 8 years, also inflaming Arab nationalist sentiments and adding urgency to calls for reclaiming lost territory, particularly among Egypt and Syria. However, the United States, still highly dependent on Arab oil imports to help bolster its own domestic supply, continued to do regular business with OPEC nations, and from an annual import level of around 350 million barrels in the late 1950s, the US by 1973 was importing over 6 million barrels of oil per day, and though imports had been limited by a quota system introduced under President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1959, the rapid growth in demand eventually rendered these restrictions obsolete. Meanwhile, President Nixon, after initially resisting reform, dismantled the quota system in 1973 in an effort to stabilize prices and ensure supply, with this move making the United States significantly more reliant on imported oil, particularly from the Middle East, which by 1972 accounted for the vast majority of American oil imports, though nominal prices remained flat throughout the 1960s, and inflation-adjusted costs actually fell year by year, thereby contributing to the rapid economic growth, rising living standards, and industrial expansion in the West. However, the ice would finally break on October 6, 1973, during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israeli positions in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, with their goal being to reverse the territorial losses and restore Arab pride following the humiliation of the Six-Day War. The conflict quickly escalated and drew in the broader international community, with many Arab states rallying in support of their offensive, while the United States responded by authorizing Operation Nickel Grass, a significant military resupply airlift delivering arms and equipment to Israel, providing up to $2.2 billion worth of weapons and equipment to support their defense against the Arab nations. In retaliation, on October 17, 1973, the member states of OPEC announced a coordinated 5% reduction in oil production, with a commitment to cut production further on a monthly basis, followed 3 days later by Saudi Arabia taking the unprecedented step of enforcing a full embargo on all oil shipments to the United States, where this move was swiftly supported by several other Arab nations and extended to additional Western states such as the Netherlands and Portugal, who were likewise perceived as pro-Israel in their diplomatic stance. Although Saudi oil accounted for only a small percentage, roughly 4% of the total US oil imports at the time, the geopolitical ripple effects were profound and immediate, with global oil markets being already tightly balanced, and the sudden reduction in output ignited panic among importing nations, while in the span of mere weeks, the price of oil skyrocketed. By December 1973, the posted price of crude oil had risen from $3 to $11.65 per barrel, effectively quadrupling, and when adjusted for inflation, this meant a jump from around $17 per barrel to over $60, a dramatic increase that fundamentally reshaped the global economic landscape, with the resulting shortage of petroleum products leading to severe fuel scarcity across the United States, prompting long queues at petrol stations that often stretched for blocks. Motorists, desperate to secure fuel, faced hours-long waits, and in an attempt to manage the crisis, many states implemented odd-even rationing schemes based on vehicle license plate numbers, while others prohibited weekend sales of petrol altogether, turning Sundays into silent reminders of the nation's vulnerability. The economic repercussions within the United States were immediate and damaging, with petrol prices increased by more than 40% in less than a year, jumping from an average of 38.5 cents per gallon in May 1973 to 55.1 cents by June 1974, with these fuel price hikes filtering rapidly throughout the broader economy, with transportation costs surging and placing upward pressure on the prices of consumer goods. Food, which relied heavily on fuel-intensive distribution networks, became notably more expensive, while heating homes during the winter became costlier, disproportionately affecting low-income households, and inflation, which had been mounting before the crisis, accelerated sharply, with consumer confidence plummeting and businesses facing growing uncertainty, with 1975 seeing the Federal Energy Administration report that the embargo had been responsible for the loss of approximately 500,000 American jobs and had wiped out between $10 and $20 billion in gross national product. The social fabric of American life also underwent noticeable changes, with nationwide speed limits being reduced to 55 miles an hour to promote fuel efficiency, Christmas lights were scaled back or banned in some states to conserve electricity, public campaigns urged Americans to turn off unnecessary lights and to curtail driving, and the phrase gas guzzler entered popular vocabulary, becoming shorthand for the large, inefficient vehicles that had previously dominated American roads. The oil crisis, in this regard, essentially opened the door to the Japanese and European import in the United States, with many consumers reconsidering their automotive preferences, contributing to a sharp rise in the popularity of smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles such as the Volkswagen Dacia, the Toyota Corona, the Toyota Celica, and the Datsun Cherry. On the political stage, the Nixon administration launched Project Independence, a national initiative aimed at making the United States self-sufficient in energy by 1980, with a plan calling for increased domestic oil drilling, accelerated development of coal and nuclear power, and enhanced conservation efforts. And while this goal was never fully achieved, the initiative marked a turning point in American energy policy and led to the creation of the Department of Energy in 1977, tasked with coordinating national energy strategy, and spurred the establishment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to provide a buffer against future supply disruptions. However, while the embargo was officially lifted in March 1974, after intense diplomatic negotiations, its consequences endured for the rest of the decade and beyond, with the economic disruption it caused helping to usher in a period of stagflation that plagued the United States throughout the 1970s, while also undermining public confidence in the government's ability to manage crises, further exacerbated by the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation in 1974. As for the car builders, the results were alarming, with General Motors, the industry's dominant force and the most profitable manufacturer in America, issuing a striking announcement on December 28, 1973, that it would lay off 86,000 workers in response to slumping sales and falling production, of which those affected would include 38,000 employees facing indefinite layoffs, while 48,000 others were placed on temporary furloughs lasting up to 10 days. These cuts followed a previous 5-day suspension of work for 126,000 employees just 1 week earlier, the scale of which sent tremors through the industry and served as a clear signal of distress, with a statement accompanying the announcement by Chairman Richard C. Gerstenberg acknowledging the steep drop in sales of large vehicles, which were increasingly viewed as impractical under conditions of rising fuel costs and limited availability. He projected that total vehicle sales for 1974 could fall by as much as 12% compared to the previous year, a sobering forecast that necessitated a fundamental reorganization of GM's production priorities, with this shift including redirecting capital and labor towards more compact, fuel-efficient vehicles, even as management privately wrestled with doubts about the long-term viability of such a strategy. By June 24, 1974, Gerstenberg was actively engaged in public reassurance, and during appearances, he insisted that General Motors had no reason to feel embarrassed, with the company, as he maintained, being merely the victim of an unforeseeable geopolitical shock, not a failure of leadership or foresight, and he described the sales decline as a transient phenomenon, rooted in consumer confusion and panic, and pointed to internal efforts already underway to adjust to the new landscape. Despite these assertions, Wall Street remained skeptical, with investor confidence waning, and GM's stock price dipped to its lowest point of the year, while 2 months later, on March 24, 1974, the true scale of the crisis became unavoidable, as by that point, GM's sales had plummeted by more than 35% compared to the same period the previous year. Production lines lay dormant in multiple states, nearly 65,000 workers had been dismissed outright, and another 57,000 were effectively in limbo, their futures tied to a volatile market, and for the first time in decades, General Motors was no longer the most profitable industrial corporation in America, that distinction having passed in almost a cruel irony to the Exxon Corporation, the emblem of the very commodity that had so destabilized GM's fortunes. Security analysts warned of a catastrophic drop in earnings, forecasting first-quarter profits of merely 35 cents per share, a dramatic fall from the $2.84 posted during the same quarter in 1973, while internally, debate intensified about the scale and pace of change required, with Gerstenberg continuing to exude measured optimism, suggesting that with the recent lifting of the oil embargo, demand might soon stabilize. Critics, though, saw this perspective as willfully naive, among them being John DeLorean, the flamboyant former vice president who had long agitated for a shift towards smaller vehicles, who argued forcefully that the crisis had not created the trend towards compacts but had merely accelerated it, and that this consumer transition had been years in the making, though General Motors, bound by its legacy and stifled by its own bureaucratic rigidity, had failed to heed the warning signs. As 1974 drew to a close, General Motors have been forced to shut down multiple facilities, halt investments in large car production lines, and start retooling for smaller models, but resistance still lingered, with the managerial philosophy championed by Alfred P. Sloan, who had built GM into a vertically integrated behemoth premised on continuous product enlargement and feature accumulation, remained deeply embedded. Executives insisted that consumer demand for size and luxury, especially in markets less affected by fuel shortages like Canada, would eventually reassert itself, while internally, many clung to the belief that the full-size car, albeit improved in fuel efficiency and slightly downsized, would retain its cultural and commercial primacy. External analysts were less convinced, though, with management thinkers such as Peter Drucker openly questioning whether GM's sheer size and dominant market position had become strategic liabilities, with Drucker positing that General Motors had consciously avoided entering the small car market too aggressively in previous decades to sidestep antitrust scrutiny, thereby surrendering critical market territory to Japanese and European competitors, and that when the tide turned and consumer sentiment shifted, GM found itself ill-prepared, burdened with aging infrastructure and a bloated cost base, and forced to react from a position of weakness. Though GM had introduced models like the Vega and imported various Opel models from Europe, these offerings were neither sufficient in volume nor compelling in design to mount a serious defense against imports, while Ford was poised to overtake GM in compact car production by 1975, though GM insisted that models like the Chevelle and Cutlass, weighing over 2 tons, qualified as small cars, even as the company's marketing materials categorized them as intermediates. In reality, the Vega, Opel, and a lightweight minicar developed in Brazil represented GM's only true entries into the small car market, with the latter not being produced in the United States until 1976, while at the same time, General Motors faced growing scrutiny for its role in suppressing public transit options, with allegations that it had used its dominance in the bus and locomotive markets to stifle competition, surfacing in court filings and Senate inquiries. A federal lawsuit accused the company of monopolizing city bus production and of leveraging control over diesel engines and components to prevent meaningful competition, with GM attempting to burnish its public image by launching a new transportation systems division under Donald J. Atwood, an engineer who had previously overseen aspects of the Apollo space program, though this appeared a cosmetic gesture rather than a sincere commitment to systemic change. The company's internal culture exacerbated its troubles, with its executive ranks being composed largely of conservative Midwestern men who had spent their entire careers within GM's insular environment, with dissent being rare and innovation often having to navigate through multiple layers of bureaucracy before reaching the boardroom, with John DeLorean's departure being emblematic of this environment, as he presented a rare voice for change, and whose resignation raised questions about whether a maverick could ever thrive within General Motors' deeply hierarchical and consensus-driven structure. On the other hand, the Ford Motor Company, although suffering many of the same setbacks, demonstrated slightly greater agility in responding to the crisis, but had still been slow to recognize the potential for an energy supply shortage, as had been identified as early as the spring of 1973, and for Ford, which had built much of its business model around the assumption of cheap and plentiful gasoline, the implications of the oil crisis were initially disastrous. By December 1973, Ford, like General Motors and Chrysler, announced sweeping layoffs in response to plummeting sales and disrupted production schedules, with more than 12,000 employees being let go across 13 plants, the majority of whom worked at stamping facilities producing parts for vehicles that were no longer selling, with these layoffs being the first major industry-wide cuts since the downturn of 1970, and they symbolized the rapid unraveling of a once thriving sector. The scale of Ford's difficulties became evident in its year-end financial reporting, as while the company recorded record profits for the full year of 1973, totaling $907 million, its fourth-quarter performance collapsed, with net income in the final 3 months of the year falling precipitously by 76%, dropping from $240 million to just $57 million. The company attributed this dramatic reversal to a cocktail of contributing factors, including sagging demand for large vehicles, a costly 15-day strike at its Canadian operations, and rising capital expenditure associated with retooling plans to produce more compact models. And while the headline annual profit painted a picture of ongoing strength, it masked the deep structural vulnerabilities that had been exposed by the oil shock. Faced with these new realities, Ford moved swiftly to adapt, with executives pushing forward with the acceleration of small car production, breathing new life into vehicles such as the Maverick and Comet, while also bringing new models to the market with the Mustang II, a significantly downsized version of the original pony car, becoming emblematic of this strategic pivot. Designed to appeal to customers seeking a more fuel-efficient yet stylish vehicle, the Mustang II was launched just as public sentiment began to coalesce around smaller cars, while additionally, Ford promoted sales of the Pinto and the imported Capri, the latter being assembled in Europe and offering a blend of affordability and European styling that appealed to American buyers. By early 1974, the company was already seeing tangible results for its strategic redirection, with small cars making up nearly half of Ford's total vehicle sales in the first quarter of the year, with the Maverick, Comet, Pinto, Capri and Mustang II collectively demonstrating that Ford could respond, albeit under pressure, to market demands. However, these gains were not sufficient to insulate the company from the broader economic fallout, and by April, Ford's first-quarter net income had plunged by nearly 66% compared to the same period in 1973, dropping from $361 million to $124 million, while material and labor costs had risen far beyond initial forecasts, nearly doubling in some instances, and global vehicle sales were down by 17%, with domestic sales dropping by a significant 24%. Canada emerged as a rare bright spot in the otherwise bleak picture, as unlike the United States, Canada was less severely affected by oil shortages, and this relative stability was reflected in sales figures, with Ford's truck sales in Canada rising by 20% during the first quarter of 1974, while car sales declined by only 3%. In public statements, Ford executives maintained a posture of cautious optimism, projecting that vehicle sales would recover in the latter half of the year, predicting 10 million cars and 2.8 million trucks would be sold in the United States by year's end, provided that oil supplies remained steady and economic conditions improved, while the company also continued to affirm its commitment to small car development and sought to reassure stakeholders that its current investments were aligned with a reshaped automotive landscape. Privately, though, Ford understood that it was no longer operating in the same world it had dominated just a few years earlier, with material shortages, fluctuating fuel prices, high inflation, and a more discerning public, all combining to make the post-embargo period one of continuous adjustment, and by the end of 1974, the company found itself navigating not merely a downturn, but a fundamental transformation of its business model. The Chrysler Corporation, the smallest and most financially fragile of the big three, experienced a more severe operational crisis, with Chrysler's attempt to reposition itself within a changing market landscape having begun in earnest in 1971 when it introduced the Dodge Colt, a subcompact car imported from Japan through a partnership with Mitsubishi Motors. This marked the corporation's first significant collaboration with its future Japanese ally and was a clear attempt to address the rising consumer interest in smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, though the Colt struggled to gain traction, as unlike its American rivals, the Ford Pinto and the Chevy Vega, the Colt was not a wholly domestic product, and Chrysler lacked its own four-cylinder engine, forcing it to rely entirely on imported mechanics which undermined perceptions of reliability and domestic identity. More significantly, Chrysler failed to capitalize on the engineering expertise already available within its own European subsidiaries, with these overseas divisions having long specialized in building compact, fuel-efficient vehicles that complied with stricter environmental standards and were well ahead in terms of emissions control and space efficiency. Rather than incorporating these technologies into its American operations, Chrysler's leadership instead opted to detune its existing range of engines as an expedient solution aimed at meeting newly introduced federal regulations, but one that came with substantial drawbacks, as not only did this result in compromised performance, but paradoxically fuel economy often worsened, just as petrol prices began their sharp upward climb. Chrysler's smaller production scale compared to its larger rivals compounded its difficulties, and economies of scale were crucial when it came to investing in new technologies and complying with regulatory standards. And for Chrysler, the cost of these transitions consumed a greater share of its resources, with 1973 having seen the company commit roughly $400 million to restyle and update its line of large cars for the coming model year, in the belief that American taste would remain consistent. This investment turned out to be disastrously mistimed upon the start of the oil embargo, as with petrol prices soaring and availability growing uncertain, buyers abruptly turned away from full-size vehicles and began favoring compact and subcompact alternatives, with Chrysler having focused its efforts and capital on its large car portfolio being caught off guard and burdened with unsold inventory. Sales of vehicles such as the Dodge Monaco and Plymouth Fury plummeted, while demand for smaller models like the Dodge Dart and Plymouth Valiant rose sharply, though even as consumer demand shifted, Chrysler struggled to adapt quickly, with its manufacturing facilities, long optimized for large vehicle production, being not easily convertible to support small car output, and the firm faced logistical constraints in ramping up production of the vehicles now most in demand. Further exacerbating the crisis was a growing shortage of key raw materials, particularly plastics derived from petroleum, with November 1973 seeing Chrysler compelled to announce the temporary shutdown of 4 of its compact car plants due to a shortage of plastic parts, presenting a stark illustration of how much modern cars depended increasingly on plastic components for interiors, body fittings, and underhood elements, and the scarcity of these materials left Chrysler, like much of the automotive industry, scrambling to maintain output in a volatile manufacturing environment. By the close of November, it had become clear that the shift in consumer behavior was not a temporary phenomenon, with internal sales data showing that Chrysler's full-size models were experiencing steep year-over-year declines, while compacts were surging, with the Dodge Monaco having seen its sales fall by a third, while the Plymouth Fury suffered an even greater drop. Conversely, sales of the Dodge Dart rose by 25%, and the Plymouth Valiant by 31% in the same period, and in response to this dramatic reversal, Chrysler made the strategic decision to convert its Newark, Delaware assembly plant, one of its key facilities for large car production, to build compact vehicles instead, with this transition being scheduled to begin in January 1974, and was one of several emergency measures taken to realign production with market demand. As the company moved into 1974, the challenges showed no sign of abating, with widespread material shortages, fluctuating oil supply, inflationary pressures, and regulatory uncertainty making forward planning increasingly difficult, while the risks of layoffs loomed over Chrysler's workforce, though union agreements ensured that employees with sufficient tenure would continue to receive most of their pay during temporary shutdowns, and overtime was curtailed across numerous plants, though executives still hoped to avoid a major collapse in production volume. In February 1974, Chrysler published its financial results for the fourth quarter of the previous year, revealing a 12% decline in quarterly profits, with this drop attributed directly to the effects of the energy crisis, which had discouraged consumers from visiting showrooms or pushed them towards less profitable compact cars, though the full-year figures for 1973 painted a more complex picture, with the company having posted a 16% rise in net income, earning $255.5 million, up from $220.5 million in 1972, as driven by record global sales. Chrysler had sold over 2.2 million vehicles in North America and a further 1.25 million units overseas, with earnings from its international operations having surged dramatically, with income from foreign subsidiaries rising to $121 million from just $29.6 million the year before, highlighting the growing importance of Chrysler's overseas markets to its bottom line. Despite these apparent successes, Chrysler's leadership remained cautious in their outlook, with Chairman Lynn A. Townsend and President John J. Ricardo both warning that 1974 would likely bring even greater difficulties, citing not only declining consumer demand in the United States, but also inflationary pressures and continued disruptions in fuel supply as critical threats to their profitability. Nevertheless, they pointed to potential paths forward, including the expansion of Chrysler's compact and subcompact offerings, ongoing partnerships with Japanese firms such as Mitsubishi, and possible new model development aimed at capitalizing on the shift towards small cars. Finally, at the bottom of the market, AMC, which had always operated on the periphery of the industry's major players, also found itself in a precarious position, though at first glance the company appeared well positioned to benefit from this turn of events, as it had historically been known for its smaller cars and frugal engineering, with the company having long carved a niche for itself in a market dominated by the Big Three. However, by 1973, AMC had become increasingly entangled in ambitious ventures and costly expansions that undermined its agility, with its once clear identity as a manufacturer of practical and economical cars having been diluted through efforts to compete more broadly across the spectrum of American car segments. One of AMC's most significant strategic decisions in the early 1970s had been the acquisition of Chrysler Jeep in 1970, a move that brought with it a suite of off-road and utility vehicles, along with a valuable portfolio of military and postal service contracts, with this purchase proving to be one of the company's most forward-looking maneuvers. As the decade progressed, the Jeep name would come to represent the most consistently profitable and enduring asset in AMC's inventory, with vehicles such as the Jeep CJ and the Wagoneer, which appealed to recreational drivers and off-road enthusiasts alike, continuing to enjoy popularity even as gasoline prices soared, thanks to their unique place in the market and a lack of direct competition. Alongside its growing Jeep division, AMC continued to offer a range of passenger cars, with the Hornet, introduced in 1970, having developed into a solid performer in the compact car market that was built on a versatile platform and available in various body styles that appealed to cost-conscious buyers, while the Gremlin, introduced the same year, had been marketed as the first domestically produced subcompact car. AMC also continued to invest in its mid-size and full-size car lines, with the Matador, which had succeeded the Rebel in 1971, being available in sedan, station wagon and later coupe variants, with the 1974 introduction of the Matador Coupe being recognized by Car and Driver as the best-styled car of that year, though this praise did not translate into commercial success. Meanwhile, the Ambassador, the company's largest and most luxurious offering, underwent its final major revision in 1974, with the car being extended further in length, partially in response to new federal safety regulations requiring energy-absorbing bumpers, thus making it the largest vehicle AMC had ever produced, though the timing of this enlargement was deeply unfortunate. With petrol prices escalating and public sentiment turning firmly against large vehicles, the Ambassador quickly fell out of favor and sales collapsed, with the model being quietly discontinued at the end of the 1974 model year, bringing an end to one of the longest-running nameplates in American automotive history. AMC, though, were not unaware of the need for technological advancement, and in 1973 entered into a licensing agreement with Curtiss-Wright to develop Wankel rotary engines, a type of internal combustion engine that promised smooth operation and high power output in a compact package, with the rotary engine being seen as a potential answer to performance concerns in smaller cars. However, the oil crisis radically altered the calculus, and the Wankel engine, while compact and smooth, was inefficient and emitted more pollutants than conventional piston engines, with these shortcomings rendering it unviable in a market now prioritizing fuel economy and emissions compliance, and as a result, AMC's rotary program was shelved with little fanfare, one of the many casualties of the new economic order. By the end of 1974, AMC, despite isolated strengths such as its Jeep brand and a few popular compact models, was under severe financial strain, with development costs continuing to climb, while the company's existing plants, especially its aging Kenosha facility, struggled with inefficiencies that larger rivals were increasingly able to overcome through scale and investment. However, the company retained a reputation for durability in the used car market, and its compact offerings continued to attract loyal customers, while Jeep remained a valuable differentiator, tapping into a segment that was still underserved, though AMC's limited capital and smaller dealer network meant it could not easily shift direction or ramp up production of more suitable vehicles in response to changing consumer demand, lacking the financial reserves and engineering manpower of its larger competitors. Thus, 1974 ended in dismal fashion for the American motor industry, demonstrating that what had once appeared to be an invulnerable institution could indeed be rattled to its core by too many bad habits that left it vulnerable to market shocks such as the previous year's oil crisis, as well as an ignorance of the potential for imports to move into the void left by the retreating Big Three. However, the 1973 oil crisis proved only to be the beginning of the American motor industry's rough ride throughout the 1970s, and more harsh lessons would need to be learned before these grand icons of industry would be able to claw back their influence and set a course of sustainability going forward into the 1980s.